hands always be busy. May your feet always be swift. May you have a strong foundation when the winds of change shift. May your heart always be joyful. May your song always be sung. May you stay forever young. And these are lyrics from a song by Bob Dylan, but there are many poems and songs just like this one that talk about staying forever young. But the authors of these works are not talking about age. What they're talking about is a state of mind. Maintaining the young at heart mindset throughout life is important. Maybe even more important as the older we get, as life is often tough and stressful. The author, Shel Silverstein, uses his work to remind children and adults alike to maintain the mindset of young at heart, to have a happier lifestyle. Shel Silverstein was an incredibly talented poet, cartoonist, songwriter, and children's author from Chicago. He began his journey drawing and writing from a very young age, and although he had no formal training, he would become most famously known for his children's books. But anyone who has read a book by Shel know his words speak to the soul, no matter what age you are. And his poems provoke thought and have taught us many life lessons. And today I'm going to share with you a poem from his book called Everything on It, called Growing Down. Makes a grunt and a grumble, a sneer and a frown. And what do you have? Why, old Mr. Brown, the crabbiest man in our whole darn town. We all called him Grow Up Brown. For years, each girl and boy and pup heard him say, grow up, grow up, grow up. He'd say, why don't you be polite? Why must you shout and fuss and fight? Why can't you keep dirt off your clothes? Why can't you remember to wipe your nose? Why must you always make such noise? Why don't you go and pick up your toys? Why do you hate to wash your hands? Why are your shoes all filled with sand? Why must you shout when I'm lying down? Why don't you grow up, grumped Grow Up Brown. And one day we said to Grow Up Brown, hey, why don't you try growing down? Why don't you crawl on your knees? Why don't you try climbing trees? Why don't you bang on a tin can drum? Why don't you chew bubble gum? Why don't you play kick the can? Why don't you try not washing your hands? Why don't you join the baseball team? Why don't you yell and jump and scream? Why don't you try skipping stones? Why don't you eat ice cream cones? Why don't you cry when you feel sad? Why don't you cuddle with your dad? Why don't you have weenie roasts? Why don't you believe in ghosts? Why don't you have pillow fights? Why don't you sleep with your teddy at night? Why don't you swing from monkey bars? Why don't you wish on falling stars? Why don't you run in 3-leg races? And why don't you make weirdy faces? Why don't you smile, Grow Up Brown? Why don't you try growing down? Then Grow Up Brown, he scrunched and frowned and scratched his head and walked around, and finally he said with a helpless sound, maybe I will try growing down. So Grow Up Brown began to sing. He started doing silly things. He started making weirdy faces and came in first in 3-leg races. He swung from monkey bars. All night he'd lie and count the stars. He tooted horns and banged on drums. He spent $20 on chewing gum. He went to all the weenie roasts, and once he thought he saw a ghost. He got to be great at pillow fights and went to sleep with his teddy at night. He flew a kite and kicked a can. He rubbed some dirt upon his hands. He drew a picture and threw some stones, ate 47 ice cream cones. He got some sand between his toes. He got a loose tooth and a bloody nose. He got a dog. They rolled in mud. He imitated Elmer Fudd. He climbed a roof, though no one asked. He broke his wrist. He wore a cast. He rolled down hills and climbed up trees. He scuffed his elbows and skinned his knees. He joined the baseball team, and when they said no, he spit and screamed. He cried when he was feeling sad and went and cuddled with his dad. He wore a hat that didn't fit and learned just how far that he could spit. He learned to wrestle and get tickled. He sucked his thumb. He belched and giggled. He got his trousers torn and stained. He ran out barefoot in the rain, shouting to all the folks in the town, it's much more fun, this growing down. Now this poem reminds us that as we get older, we should still make sure to stop and appreciate all the small things in life that bring us joy. that even though we're adults and life can be hard, it would still benefit us all to look at life through the eyes of a young child. As I finish, I would like you to ask yourself a question. Why don't you try growing down?